Mastodon. Before I start, feel free to come on down to the Headwaters Science Center any day of the week. Monday through Saturday, we are open 9 to 5, and actually 9:30 to 5, sorry. And on Sunday, we're open 1 to 5. So, I'm Carl. We got Finn behind the camera. Hi. So today we are talking about Mastodon, which might seem a little bit weird given that last weekend I talked about mammoths. A lot of people use these two names interchangeably, despite the fact these are not really similar animals on a taxonomic level. So, Mastodon would have been in the kingdom Animalia, phylum Chordata, and class Mammalia, like any of these Ice Age mammals for the Ice Age ones we're looking at. They're in the order Proboscidae, so that is the same order that elephants are in and mammoths are in. But once you get past order, they are no longer all that closely grouped. Mastodon are in the family Mammut, or Mammutidae, the genus Mammoth. They're some of the only members of that. So, Mastodon were only native to North America. They're actually kind of a cool bit of endemic prehistoric wildlife. You don't find Mastodon fossils anywhere else on Earth, pretty much. Their ancestors were from Africa and migrated through Eurasia into North America, though. Mastodon were around roughly 5.3 million years ago, just to 10,000 years ago, which is really recent. They were a browsing herbivore, like we've talked about with some of the dinosaurs we went over, meaning they would browse from higher vegetation, not going for grazing. They were coniferous forest specialists. That was where most of the fossils are found, in areas that were once coniferous forests. They stood about 7 to 9 feet at the shoulder, about the size of a modern Asian elephant. Estimates from about 7.8 tons to possibly 11 tons for a large mastodon. And they had very long bodies, very long heads and skulls. Their legs were proportionately a little bit shorter, and they were heavily muscled animals. And then they probably would have been hairy, and their tusks would have been straighter than a mammoth's, not as much curl on them. But yeah, no, so we have, just for scale, we've got a person next to the little thing, so we're going to zoom in on that. But then the other thing is I've done a really terrible drawing of teeth below that. So right here, we have what a mastodon tooth would look like. They're very conical sort of cusps on their teeth. Their name, mastodon, actually does mean nipple tooth. And those are great for shearing away vegetation off of tree branches and such with their trunk kind of grabbed. Whereas a mammoth's tooth, as we looked at last weekend, you'll notice had relatively flat cusps, more for grinding up softer vegetation like grasses. And that is one of the things. These were both large proboscideans living in similar areas. They were very similar looking animals, but they did different things. Typically, you wouldn't see two large herbivores cohabitating in such a way if there wasn't something keeping them from competing the other. This is an example of what we would like to call niche partitioning, where these two animals changed what and where they ate to avoid competing. Mammoths staying to more open areas, and Mastodon inhabiting tighter forested areas. So one of the things is, why only in North America? Why didn't these spread back into Eurasia and other places where there were boreal forests they could have done well in? One of the things with that would be geographic isolation and habitat fragmentation. These animals lived in a very specific habitat, and likely crossing large expanses of grassland in the Ice Age would not have really been possible for these, given that their diet was typically more leafy and coniferous plant matter. Suddenly entering a large habitat that has none of that isn't really feasible. And geographic isolation happens basically when animals have some sort of natural barrier, like a mountain, waterway, that prevents them from entering another nearby habitat. So Mastodon diverged from other proboscideans and then were isolated in North America for a while, as the land bridge that they crossed initially went away. By the time the next land bridge formed, they were too specialized already to make that trip back. And habitat fragmentation, so during the Ice Age in North America, when these animals were around, one of the things that would have affected them and restricted their range a little bit was available coniferous boreal forests. So they would have been living in pockets. They wouldn't have been traversing as wide areas like mammoths were. But one of the things that a lot of people ask is, why did these go extinct? And that's a little bit more of a loaded question with these ones than it is with mammoth. So at the end of the Ice Age, boreal forest expanded and spread northward, reducing the mammoth's habitat. And with a bit of hunting from humans as well, would have put heavy pressure on such slow-breeding animals that they likely couldn't adapt in time. But the thing everyone always wonders is, why would Mastodon go extinct at the exact time that their habitat expanded? They suddenly had access to far more land that was good for what they needed. And this is one where oftentimes it is pointed to human hunting of these animals, potentially making them go extinct. There's not a lot of other big ecological factors that could have led to it. There was some change in forest composition that could have been partially responsible, with an increase in deciduous vegetation that may have actually reduced the amount of forest these animals could actually eat, as they were pretty heavily conifer specialists. And suddenly with more diverse forests and such, that may have actually reduced the total amount of edible vegetation in that forest. These are all hypotheses. We're not sure yet. Mastodon aren't quite as well studied as some of the other Ice Age megafauna, but nonetheless, I find them quite interesting. They're not as extreme as mammoths, so they don't quite stick in your head as well. They kind of get overshadowed by the other similar-looking animals at the time. But it's still a very interesting creature. There were a couple species of them. I think about 11 species of Mastodon in their time on Earth, which shows how successful they were able to be. Again, these animals really weren't all that much bigger than a modern-day elephant, if at all. These animals probably would have only been approximately the size to Asian elephants. But they were wildly successful for a couple million years. And that's always something that any animal that's that successful is worth studying and knowing more about, especially when an animal like this may have had multiple issues, and issues that we aren't still quite able to detect yet happen to it ecologically. It's great to know for species security as climate change hits us now. We don't know how that's going to affect the animals we have today. So it's always good to study why these animals go extinct, because that'll help us understand the modern animals that are under similar pressures, and potentially prevent future extinctions of animals that might be going extinct due to stuff like climate change that is aggravated and caused by us and our practices. Yeah. Do you have any questions about these, Ridley?
Do they have good eyesight, hearing, or are they just very big? Or?
So with Mastodon, they are in the general Proboscidean order, so they probably had comparable eyesight to an elephant, which is pretty good. Being tall and large definitely does help, especially if you're trying to see further away. And probably had pretty good hearing. I haven't actually seen anyone put a lot of research into the auditory area, like Bula and like canal for these, but it'd be really interesting to see, because that's something that people often tend to assume, probably just like an elephant, despite the fact that these guys aren't even in the same family as elephants, so they could have been somewhat different. Being large definitely probably was a natural defense against predators, because when you're that big, there's not a lot that can eat you. And that is, again, like we talked about the mammoths, getting that big is a great defense against getting cold, and against, something like a saber-toothed cat or a cave lion or hyena deciding you look like dinner. Unfortunately, humans are quite well known for hunting large animals because we are pretty good at it. But yeah, no. I think these are the state. Do you know what state they're the state fossil of, by any chance?
I don't.
We're gonna look this up really quick because it is kind of fun. They tend not to get the big spotlight, but they do get the claim to fame as being the state fossil somewhere. State fossil. Okay, so these are the state fossil of Michigan, I believe, which is kind of cool. Finn, do you have any questions about Mastodon at all?
So, did they use that trunk like elephants do for water?
It's
or-
very likely they would use it for grabbing vegetation or drinking. Again, this is the thing. The trunk is a relatively specialized organ. We haven't actually talked about what its structure is, really. I realized that we went through mammoths and didn't actually bring up what the trunk is. So the trunk is a mix of, it's a fusion of the nose and upper lip that has a lot of muscle in it, which allows that flexibility and dexterity that it has. That is a very specialized organ, so it's very likely they were using it for the same purpose. Proboscideans were a little bit more diverse than we see today. Today we're pretty much only seeing just the tip of the iceberg. Mastodon, mammoths, and elephants aren't the only ones. There are other animals like gomphotheres, which had 4 tusks. There's other more specialized proboscideans who had more reduced trunks. It's actually a really fun thing. We might go through a few more of the proboscideans at some point in the future. But the trunk was likely used similar to how elephants do today. It's a great advantage if you're browsing, especially. If you've ever seen forest elephants in Africa or Asia eat, oftentimes being able to reach up and grab vegetation. Sort of like when we talked about Therizinosaurus, actually, with the arms. Just the ability to reach a little bit further than your mouth towards food gives you an advantage, especially in times when food might be scarce and those hard-to-reach sources become a bit more crucial. Any other
Were
thoughts
they
on
very
this?
fast?
They likely were about as, just judging by the shorter legs, might not have been as fast as modern elephants with a proportionately shorter stride. Again, wouldn't be slow by any means. If you've ever seen how fast elephants can move, while elephants technically can't run, in most scientists' view of what running is, an elephant can get shuffling after you at a speed where you need to get in the car to get away. These guys probably would be hitting around the same speeds. Enough to chase off a predator or something, or to get away if they really had to. But by no means speedy animals. You can see they had relatively round, long bodies. And just another trait of large herbivores, like we talked about sauropods, having that large body means you can have a longer, basically, gut and digestive tract, which gives you more time with that food actually being digested. And when these animals are eating stuff, really harsh stuff like conifer needles and stuff and bark, it's good to be able to put that stuff through a lot more digestion than just popping out like a rabbit does. Yeah, these are kind of fun animals. I think these animals, they're not as present in popular culture. I think the one way I remember them being is in Zoo Tycoon was a video game where they had Mastodon, which I always thought was kind of weird. As a kid, I was disappointed I couldn't get a mammoth, but looking back, it's still a pretty cool animal. And it was a good way to get those known to more people. I think that was actually the first time I'd seen and really heard much about Mastodon. You'll notice they don't show up in wildlife documentaries about Ice Age stuff that much. And I think it's just because mammoth are a little bit more familiar, a little bit easier to analogize to an elephant, and a bit bigger and more charismatic in wildlife. Oftentimes today in wildlife management, people talk about charismatic wildlife kind of overshadowing other just as important animals. So like bison tend to, and like elk tend to overshadow just, you know, regular whitetail or mule deer in a lot of ways for the public vision. It happens with paleontology and stuff too, where large charismatic animals tend to be the dominant focus of the study because it's big, it's cool looking, you can get people invested in it, where animals that are still pretty big and cool, but just not quite as extreme can get overshadowed quite easily. But yeah.